He wasn't there to ask questions. He didn't pause to consider the cost. Cobra introduced a kind of justice that didn't follow rules. It enforced its own. When Sylvester Stallone stepped into the role of Marion Cobretti, he wasn't playing a hero in the traditional sense. He was something more precise and much more dangerous. Released in the wake of Rambo, First Blood Part 2 and Rocky IV, Cobra marked a shift in Stallone's on-screen identity. Gone were the underdog. In their place stood a man who didn't care about winning hearts, just about ending threats. But beneath the gunmetal surface and clipped dialogue, Cobra carried a different weight, one the final cut only hinted at. That's because what made it to theaters was not the full picture. The original version was longer, grimmer, and far less clear in its moral stand. Cobretti, in that version, didn't save people with stoic confidence. He drifted through the film like a shadow, cold, unfeeling, and increasingly unstable. The audience didn't cheer for him. They recoiled from him. After a disastrous test screening, the studio demanded changes. Entire scenes were scrapped, subplots disappeared, and the version that might have shown Stallone at his most raw, perhaps his most honest, was buried beneath action tropes and one-liners. Yet fragments of that darker vision still remain scattered in stills, whispered about in interviews, and embedded in scenes that feel out of place, like ghosts of a different film. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Cobra, a movie that wasn't just edited for length. It was redesigned to hide what it almost revealed. Fact 1. The longer cut was almost a psychological thriller. The version of Cobra that hit theaters felt streamlined, quick, intense, and visually striking. But that wasn't how it was originally conceived. The film's first cut was over 2 hours long, and it reportedly painted a much darker, more psychological portrait of its central character. According to crew members and editors, the longer version didn't just contain extra action. It lingered on Cobra's silence, his disconnected behavior, and moments that hinted he was far more damaged than heroic. In one scene that never made the final cut, he reportedly wandered his apartment aimlessly, staring at his gun as if unsure what it was for or who it was meant to protect. The original cut wasn't about pacing, it was about atmosphere, a cold, methodical drift into urban nihilism. The line between protector and executioner blurred, and test audiences didn't know what to make of it. They didn't clap, they didn't cheer, they just sat in uncomfortable silence. That reaction terrified the studio. They ordered a major overhaul. Roughly 40 minutes were cut, and the edits weren't surgical. They were designed to reshape the very soul of the film. What remained was a tighter, more palatable version 1, where Cobra felt like a hero again, or at least a figure we could recognize. But if the stories are true, the original film didn't ask you to root for Cobra. It asked whether you'd be safe if he ever walked past you. And maybe that was the real problem. Fact 2. The novel it's based on was far more cynical. Before it was a film, Cobra was an adaptation loosely based on the crime novel Fair Game by Paula Gosling. But while the book provided the skeleton, the soul of the original story was far more grounded and morally gray than anything that made it to screen. The novel focused on a detective who wasn't a renegade hero, but a man caught between duty and personal fear. The violence was unsettling, not exhilarating. Stallone saw potential in that framework but didn't copy it directly. Instead, he pulled its mood, the isolation, the distrust, the idea that the good guys were only marginally better than the bad ones. Early drafts of the Cobra screenplay leaned hard into this tone. Scenes explored the emotional toll of a man who lived by violence and who had long since lost the ability to connect with others. But those elements were soon deemed too bleak by executives. Action replaced introspection. The cult took center stage, and the psychological nuance of the source material faded into the background. Ironically, a later film adaptation of Fair Game in 1995 stayed closer to the book and failed spectacularly. It lacked the momentum of Cobra, but also failed to recapture the depth of the novel. In the end, Cobra became something else entirely. A mutation. A film with the DNA of something smart and disturbing buried under muscle, bullets, and edited silence. Did Stallone adapt a story or overwrite it? Fact 3. Audiences didn't just dislike the first cut, they feared it. When the first audience screenings for Cobra took place, executives expected notes about pacing or action. What they got was something different: discomfort. The original version of the film didn't just entertain less, it actively unsettled viewers. The early cut reportedly leaned into emotional absence. There was little music during key scenes. Cobra barely spoke. Violence happened without catharsis, without drama, just abrupt, cold efficiency. One scene involved Cobra interrogating a suspect using pressure tactics that went well beyond what was legal or even logical. And he did it without blinking. The response was immediate. Audience members didn't walk out, but they left the theater in silence. Feedback cards described the film as draining, dark, and inhuman. The studio realized they didn't just have an action movie, they had a psychological document that looked like one. Within days, a full re-edit was ordered. Scenes were softened or removed. Dialogue was inserted. Brigitte Nielsen's character was brought forward to add warmth. Even the score was rewritten to create emotional cues where none existed before. Still, shadows of the original remain. The coldness in Cobra's eyes, the long pauses that feel too long, the subtle suggestion that he's not just emotionally distant, he might be emotionally extinct. Was the first cut a failure or simply a film that looked too directly into something we weren't meant to see? Fact 4. The night slasher was built from real-life fear. There's something eerily familiar about the night slasher, not just in his dead eyes or brutal monologues, but in how uncomfortably real he feels. That's because he wasn't created in a vacuum. Behind the scenes, he was modeled on a real killer. The early cut reportedly leaned into emotional absence. There was little music during key scenes. Cobra barely spoke. Violence happened without catharsis, without drama, just abrupt, cold efficiency. One scene involved Cobra interrogating a suspect using pressure tactics that went well beyond what was legal or even logical. And he did it without blinking. From the physical look to the cadence of his threats, Brian Thompson's portrayal was influenced by courtroom footage, police interviews, and media coverage. The phrase, "I am the future," which the slasher repeats in the film, wasn't taken from Ramirez directly, but it mirrored statements he made during trial. Stallone reportedly wanted the villain to feel like a real threat, not a caricature, not a comic book monster, a human being stripped of empathy, with just enough logic to make him terrifying. Some crew members were uneasy. They felt the performance was too grounded, too believable. And after test screenings, several of the characters' speeches were cut, not for time, but because they hit too close to home. Was the night slasher a fictional antagonist or a cinematic mirror to the very real darkness already walking American streets? Fact 5. One audition changed the entire tone of the film. Brian Thompson wasn't the first choice to play the night slasher, but once he auditioned, the role became his not because he looked the part, but because he embodied something the film hadn't yet defined. His audition wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. He sat in front of the camera and spoke softly, delivering an improvised monologue about why weakness had to be removed from society. No shouting, no movement, just direct eye contact and a voice that made the room go silent. Stallone, watching from the corner, reportedly said one thing when the tape ended: "That's him." From there, Thompson became more than just a cast member. He became the compass for the film's tone. Cold, controlled, unpredictably. On set, he remained distant. He didn't engage in banter. He avoided rehearsals when possible. The crew began treating him like his character not out of fear, but out of instinct. His presence made people uneasy, even off camera. Originally, the script included more scenes with the night slasher monologues, rituals, and ideological rants. But when test audiences reacted with unexpected fascination instead of fear, those scenes were scaled back. The studio didn't want the villain to become too compelling. What Thompson brought to the role wasn't just menace. It was conviction, the kind that doesn't blink, doesn't breathe heavy, and never asks for sympathy. Was it performance or something more unnervingly authentic? Fact 6. Stallone cut himself out of the darkest moments. As the film's writer and lead, Stallone had near total control over Cobra. He could shape the narrative, the tone, and the image of his character. But when early screenings rattled audiences, it wasn't the studio that made the most drastic cuts. It was Stallone. He entered the editing room and began removing scenes that portrayed Cobra in ways he found troubling. These weren't explosive moments, they were quiet ones. Scenes that revealed cracks in the character's mental state. Shots of Cobra sitting alone, speaking to no one, barely blinking. Moments where his sense of morality came into question. One scene, reportedly among Stallone's most intense performances, involved Cobra letting a criminal go not out of mercy, but from fatigue. It was a moment that raised more questions than answers, and it was the first to go. Insiders say Stallone was uncomfortable with how far the character had drifted from his public image. After years of building up the noble warrior archetype, Cobra's emotional deadness felt too personal, too revealing. So he erased it. Not to improve the film's pacing, but to protect something deeper. The boundary between himself and the persona he had built for the screen. Was this an artistic decision or a calculated retreat from showing the audience who Stallone might really be? Fact 7. Extras on set may not have been actors at all. The warehouse scenes in Cobra, where members of the cult gather in unison to bang axes under flickering light, feel disturbingly authentic. But what if they were? According to multiple production sources, some of the people in those scenes may not have been hired actors. Casting for extras during those sequences was done quickly through a third-party agency, which reportedly advertised the roles as expressionless, intense, and available for night shoots. What the production got was a group of individuals who not only met those expectations, they surpassed them in ways no one anticipated. Some refused to break character. Others showed up with homemade props and symbols, insisting they brought their own tools of the doctrine. One assistant director noted that during a break, a few of them were seen standing in formation, chanting low phrases that didn't match any line in the script. The crew got uneasy. Complaints were raised. Eventually, a few of these extras were removed from set without explanation, but their presence captured in brief frames throughout the film remains. To this day, no one has publicly identified them. They never appeared in credits, and no one can confirm whether they were simply deeply committed method performers or something else entirely. Did the film's portrayal of cultic violence accidentally attract real believers? And if so, did Cobra end up filming something more real than anyone intended? Fact 8. A deleted ritual killing was deemed too close to reality. One of the most infamous deleted scenes from Cobra is rarely discussed, and for good reason. Shot during the early weeks of production, the scene involved a slow, ceremonial killing with a golden-handled pair of scissors, performed by the cult in full ritual formation. The victim was tied to a chair inside an abandoned warehouse. The setting was lit only by candles. The cult circled slowly, chanting a phrase about purification, before stabbing the man with precise, deliberate movements. No screams, no chaos, just ceremony. Crew members who witnessed the shoot described the atmosphere as chilling, not dramatic, ritualistic. Several members of the post-production team reportedly requested that the footage be reviewed by studio legal before inclusion in the film. Fact 8. A deleted ritual killing was deemed too close to reality. No production stills have ever been released. No frame of the footage has surfaced publicly. Some believe the negatives were destroyed. Others say they still exist, locked away in an archive. Warner Brothers doesn't talk about. Was this simply another over-the-top horror moment, or did it blur the line between cinema and something far older? Fact 9. Nielsen's role was a strategic move, not just casting. Brigitte Nielsen's presence in Cobra wasn't coincidental. At the time, she was Stallone's wife, but her casting wasn't just a personal choice. It was a strategic move to humanize a film on the verge of emotional collapse. Early cuts of the film painted Cobretti as so cold, so emotionally unreachable, that test audiences struggled to connect with him. In response, producers pushed for more scenes between Cobra and Nielsen's character, Ingrid, even if it meant disrupting the flow of the story. The changes were subtle but intentional. Light dialogue was added. Soft lighting was used during their scenes together. Romantic tension was amplified not because it served the narrative, but because it softened the brutality surrounding it. Ironically, behind the scenes, Stallone and Nielsen's relationship was deteriorating. Arguments were frequent. Tension leaked into takes. And in some moments, the forced closeness between their characters felt more like performance than connection, critics noticed. Some praised Nielsen's presence for bringing a needed contrast, others called it forced. But what's clear is that her role was never just about plot, it was about balance, about giving the audience something warm to hold on to while the rest of the film turned to steel. Was it a romantic subplot or a last-minute rescue mission for a protagonist on the edge of becoming inhuman? Fact 10. The supermarket scene was a horror film before the studio cut it. The supermarket standoff that opens Cobra feels like a punch to the face, sudden, brutal, and efficient. But in its original form, it played more like a horror film. The scene was nearly twice as long, and it wasn't designed for thrills. It was meant to disturb. The killer wasn't introduced with yelling. He drifted through aisles, muttering about corruption and blood, smashing jars as shoppers trembled in silence. Cobra didn't charge in. He waited, built his gun in silence, walked inside like a ghost with a purpose. Deleted moments include Cobra passing by a wounded woman and barely glancing at her, and a longer exchange with the gunman not to negotiate, but to unnerve. In one cut line, Cobra asks, "What do you want the world to look like when this is over?" No answer, just a stare. Then the shot. The original ending of the scene had Cobra standing over the body longer, repeating his infamous line, "You're the disease," not as a threat, but as a self-justification. Test audiences didn't respond well. They felt no relief, no triumph, just emptiness. The studio shortened the scene dramatically. What remained still hits hard, but the psychological unease was removed. Was this about tempo? Or about toning down a protagonist who already felt more predator than protector? Fact 11. The cult's message was too close to real-life extremism. The antagonists in Cobra weren't cartoon villains. The New Order was constructed to be methodical, ideological, and eerily plausible. And that realism became a problem once the studio realized how closely their philosophy mirrored real-world extremist groups. Early versions of the film included scenes showing cult members recruiting teenagers, distributing propaganda, and justifying violence through apocalyptic rhetoric. One scrap scene reportedly featured a member explaining that weakness is contagious and the cure is pain. Studio lawyers stepped in. They worried the film could be interpreted as a depiction or worse, an endorsement of actual fringe ideologies. A subplot involving a sympathetic government official protecting the cult from investigation was also cut entirely. Fact 11. The cult's message was too close to real-life extremism. The antagonists in Cobra weren't cartoon villains. The New Order was constructed to be methodical, ideological, and eerily plausible. And that realism became a problem once the studio realized how closely their philosophy mirrored real-world extremist groups. To avoid controversy, the cult's motivations were reduced to vague slogans and physical threat. The result was a more digestible villain, one with axes and shadows, but no coherent belief system. Fact 12. The final fight took place in a real factory with a haunting reputation. The grimy, fire-lit factory, where Cobra faces off with the Night Slasher, wasn't a set. It was a real, abandoned steel plant outside Los Angeles, chosen for its decay and silence. But that silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hinted at things better left forgotten. According to location scouts, the factory had been closed for years. No one wanted to touch it. Inside, the floors were unstable, the air thick with dust, and the corners lined with rusted machinery and dark stains no one wanted to explain. During filming, crew members reported shortness of breath. Several developed rashes. A few flat out refused to enter certain wings of the building. The production brought in masks, but the atmosphere never lifted. Some swore the temperature dropped inexplicably during night shoots. After filming wrapped, a city inspection found high levels of asbestos, electrical hazards, and multiple structural failures. The site was condemned and later demolished. Today, a parking lot stands where the factory once loomed. Rumors persist that the building had a history, one involving workplace deaths, a rumored fire, and at least one unexplained fatal accident, none of it confirmed, all of it whispered. In the film, the factory feels like a descent into hell. Maybe that's because, for a short time, it actually was. Fact 13. The motorcycle chase was never in the original script. The fiery motorcycle chase that explodes onto the screen in Cobra's final act feels like the centerpiece of a big-budget action film. But it wasn't planned that way. In fact, that entire sequence was a last-minute decision, added only after early screenings left. Producers worried the film lacked traditional action beats. The original ending was smaller, tighter. Cobra cornered the Night Slasher in a factory corridor. The confrontation was meant to be slow, psychological rather than physical. But when test audiences found the pacing underwhelming, the studio demanded a more kinetic climax. What followed was a rush job. Stallone and his team wrote the chase in days. Locations were secured overnight. Stunt teams were brought in with barely enough time to prepare. The entire sequence was shot under high pressure and under high risk. One crash sent a stunt performer to the hospital. Another rig malfunctioned during a flame shot, nearly burning down part of the set, but deadlines loomed. The footage was stitched together quickly, and the final result, while thrilling, didn't quite match the rest of the film's tone. The fiery motorcycle chase that explodes onto the screen in Cobra's final act feels like the centerpiece of a big-budget action film. But it wasn't planned that way. In fact, that entire sequence was a last-minute decision, added only after early screenings left. Producers worried the film lacked traditional action beats. What followed was a rush job. Stallone and his team wrote the chase in days. Locations were secured overnight. Stunt teams were brought in with barely enough time to prepare. The entire sequence was shot under high pressure and under high risk. Fact 14. Stallone became a ghost on set, and no one questioned it. Actors staying in character during shoots isn't new, but on the set of Cobra, Stallone's behavior went beyond preparation. For large portions of the production, he was described as completely silent, even between takes. Crew members said Stallone didn't engage in casual talk, avoided eye contact, and remained seated alone while lighting setups happened around him. Some thought it was method acting. Others called it detachment. But according to insiders, Stallone was trying something deliberate. He wanted to project Cobra's emotional absence in every scene, and the best way to do that was to become emotionally vacant himself. He reportedly skipped multiple rehearsals, refused to discuss character motivation, and even rewrote lines to remove emotional beats. Fact 14. Stallone became a ghost on set, and no one questioned it. The result is a performance that borders on blank, and it works. But behind it was a process that unnerved the people around him. A grip described it as like working next to a machine with human skin. Was it a commitment to craft or something closer to a man hiding behind the mask he created? Fact 15. A real-life murder case named Cobra as a psychological trigger. In 1987, Cobra was unexpectedly dragged into the public eye. Again, not through a sequel, but through a courtroom. A young man on trial for a brutal homicide claimed that watching Cobra had helped fuel the act. And this wasn't just mentioned, it was entered into official evidence. The defense argued that the film's portrayal of justice, cold, unrelenting, detached, resonated with their client's unstable mindset. They said he watched it repeatedly, memorized lines from the Night Slasher, and even sketched out scenes from the movie in his journal. Among the most chilling details was that police found the VHS paused at the moment when Cobra delivers his iconic line, "You're the disease, I'm the cure." Psychologists debated whether the influence was direct or symbolic. The prosecution called it deflection. The jury ultimately agreed, convicting the defendant, but the trial made headlines and so did Cobra. Warner Brothers declined to comment. Stallone never addressed it publicly. But sources say the studio became more cautious with home video marketing afterward, quietly shelving plans for a director's cut. Was this a case of art inspiring violence or a violent person finding exactly the character they needed to justify what they were already becoming? Fact 16. Stallone's original tagline was too dangerous to approve. Before settling on the now iconic "Crime is a disease, meet the cure," Cobra was set to debut with a tagline that hit harder and cut deeper. Stallone had proposed something far more aggressive. "Don't run, you'll only die tired." It wasn't clever, it wasn't metaphorical. It was a threat, a direct, unapologetic declaration of Cobra's role in the story. Marketing executives were alarmed. Legal advisors flagged it immediately, calling it a liability in poster form. The 1,980 seconds were already witnessing growing concerns around glorified police violence, and Warner Brothers didn't want to fuel the fire. The tagline was killed internally. In its place came something still tough, but vague enough to pass without protest. But that didn't stop early promotional mock-ups from leaking. Years later, a few European markets even used loose translations of the banned line on VHS covers. It became an underground legend, a fragment of the Cobra that might have been. More than a marketing debate, it revealed something deeper, that the film wasn't always meant to portray Cobra as a reluctant hero. In early drafts, he was the weapon of last resort, feared as much as revered. Was the tagline too dangerous or simply too accurate for what the film really wanted to say? Fact 17. The cult was meant to be a system, not a symbol. In the final version of Cobra, the axe-wielding cult serves as a dark force, dangerous, yes, but vague in purpose. But in earlier versions of the script, the New Order was designed as something far more terrifying, a structured network with real-world parallels. Deleted scenes reportedly explored how the cult operated like a militant organization. There were training rituals, command hierarchies, and coded language. Members recruited disillusioned youth, preached ideology about social collapse, and trained in isolation. One removed subplot even revealed a city council member secretly supporting them, suggesting their reach extended far beyond back alleys and warehouses. Stallone had intended the cult to function not as nameless goons, but as an ideological machine, reflecting the kinds of extremist movements surfacing across the real world in the late 80 seconds. But that realism became a risk. Studio execs feared backlash. Comparisons to real domestic terror groups were inevitable. The solution? Strip the cult of its voice, cut their scenes, reduce them to masks, axes, and silhouettes. What remains is chilling in its own way. But something more grounded and more unnerving was left on the cutting room floor. Was it censorship? Or the studio realizing they had gotten too close to something real? Fact 18. Television broadcasts revealed a softer, hidden version of Cobra. When Cobra aired on network television, significant edits were made to comply with censorship guidelines. Violence was trimmed. Language was softened. But instead of simply cutting scenes, editors filled the gaps with footage that didn't exist in any other release. Among them were moments that shifted the tone of the film entirely. In one, Cobra sits in a diner, quietly observing a family eating together. No dialogue, just watching. In another, he confesses to Ingrid that he doesn't remember what normal feels like anymore. These scenes showed a man disconnected not by design but by damage. They weren't in the theatrical release, they weren't on VHS, and they've never been officially included in any Blu-ray or streaming edition. That's because they were alternate takes, reinserted solely for broadcast pacing, and never archived properly. One removed subplot even revealed a city council member secretly supporting them, suggesting their reach extended far beyond back alleys and warehouses. Stallone had intended the cult to function not as nameless goons, but as an ideological machine, reflecting the kinds of extremist movements surfacing across the real world in the late 80 seconds. They show a different Cobra, not the stoic killer, but the man underneath, fractured, lonely, and unsure if he even wants to keep doing what he's doing. Did censors, in trying to soften the film, accidentally reveal the truest version of the character? Fact 19. The original ending left Cobra alone and broken. The theatrical ending of Cobra wraps everything in a familiar bow. Villain defeated, love interest saved, hero riding into the horizon. But that wasn't how Stallone originally wanted the story to conclude. His first draft painted a very different picture, one without celebration and without resolution. In that version, Ingrid didn't survive the final battle. She was mortally wounded in the factory, bleeding out as Cobra fought to stop the night slasher. By the time he delivered the final blow, it was already too late. The closing scene showed Cobra in the desert, driving without destination, discarding his badge as he passed a burned-out police checkpoint. No dialogue, no music, just the quiet collapse of a man who realized he hadn't saved anyone, including himself. Fact 19. The original ending left Cobra alone and broken. Still, traces of the original survive. A lingering shot of Cobra staring into nothing after the final fight. A look that doesn't match the energy of the rest of the scene because it was never meant to be there. Did the alternate ending go too far into hopelessness, or did it simply tell the truth about what happens when violence is all that's left? Fact 20. The iconic Cobra car disappeared without a trace. The sleek, customized 1950 Mercury in Cobra isn't just a car, it's an extension of the character. Brutal, low-slung, and built like a battering ram, it became an instant icon. But after filming Wrapped, that car vanished and no one has seen it since. Officially, it was supposed to be transported to a Warner Brothers promotional garage. But somewhere between the studio lot and a storage facility, the car disappeared. At first, everyone assumed it was a paperwork issue. Then came whispers it had been stolen. Insiders say the vehicle was insured for a significant amount north of $250,000. Warner Brothers filed a quiet report, but the theft was never publicized. One theory claims a stunt coordinator took it as collateral for unpaid bonuses. Another points to an outside collector who allegedly acquired it through back channels. Over the years, there have been sightings. A near-identical vehicle showed up at a private car show in Nevada. Another was spotted in a shipping manifest headed to Eastern Europe. But no sighting has ever been verified. When asked about it in an interview, Stallone smirked and said, "Maybe Cobra didn't stop driving." The sleek, customized 1950 Mercury in Cobra isn't just a car, it's an extension of the character. Brutal, low-slung, and built like a battering ram, it became an instant icon. But after filming Wrapped, that car vanished and no one has seen it since. Bonus fact, a sequel was written, but no one wanted it seen. While Cobra left its mark as a standalone relic of 1980 seconds brutality, Stallone didn't intend to leave it there. Shortly after the film's release, he quietly drafted a sequel. The title, Cobretti, Shadow Wars. This wasn't just a follow-up, it was a departure. The treatment positioned Cobra years later, no longer a police officer, but a government asset operating in the gray. He worked alone, eliminating threats that weren't acknowledged on the record. Homegrown extremists, rogue federal agents, black ops gone wrong. The tone of the script was closer to a psychological spy thriller than an action film. Cobra barely spoke. He lived off the grid. He was broken, but functional, used by the system that once tried to silence him. Violence hadn't ended. It had become a routine. Stallone pitched the treatment to select producers, but the response was cautious. The industry wanted spectacle, not existential dread. A quiet man operating in the shadows, haunted by what justice had turned him into? That wasn't marketable, not in the late 80 seconds, not with Stallone's name attached. The script was shelved, never leaked, never developed, and Stallone never brought it up again, at least not directly. But echoes of Shadow Wars seem to ripple through films like Demolition Man and Judge Dredd, both of which feature bleak futures shaped by the abuse of control. Was the sequel too ahead of its time? Or was it too honest for the myth Cobra had become? Beneath the smoke, leather, and iconic one-liners, Cobra was never just an action film. It was a warning. Or maybe it was a confession of what happens when we stop asking why justice is served and start celebrating how. So now we ask you, if the original cut had been released, would Stallone's most feared character also have been his most honest? And what other films, buried edits, or lost truths deserve to be unearthed next? Subscribe to Behind the Fact, where we look past the credits and into the shadows they leave behind.